In the autumn of 1904, high in the French Pyrenees, a shepherd knelt in the mud beside a collapsed stone wall and picked up a handful of coins that should not have existed. They were not French, they were not Spanish, they were not Roman, not Moorish, not Visigothic, not anything the men at the museum in Toulouse could put a name to. The metal was wrong, the lettering was wrong, the faces stamped into them belonged to no king in any book of kings that Europe had ever printed. And on the back of every single coin sat the same word, a word for a country that appears on no map, in no archive, in no history taught in any classroom. The shepherd could not read it. Neither could the scholars who later turned those coins under their lamps and frowned, but the shepherd gave that country a name anyway. And for the rest of his life he swore to anyone who would sit still long enough to listen that it had once been real. This is the story of that shepherd, those coins, and the empire he claimed had been erased. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. You do not have to believe a word of it, but the questions he raised have never been cleanly answered, and the more you follow them, the stranger they get. So let us walk back up that mountain and look for ourselves. The account, such as it survives, gives his name as Bernat. He was a transhuman shepherd, one of those men who walked flocks up into the high summer pastures in June and back down again before the first snow sealed the passes. It was old work, older than France itself. His father had done it, and his father before that, along paths worn so deep into the rock that they looked less like trails and more like scars the mountains had been carrying for a very long time. Bernat could not read. This matters, so hold on to it. He had no schooling, no library, no way of inventing a fake history out of books he had never opened. He knew sheep, weather, wolves, and stone. He knew which springs ran sweet and which ran bitter, and he knew, better than any professor in Toulouse, exactly what belonged on that mountain and what did not. He also knew money, in the way poor men always know money, which is to say better than the rich. He had handled French francs and Spanish reals, worn coins passed down through the wool trade that ran across those peaks for centuries before any border was drawn. The Pyrenees were never really a wall between two countries. They were a marketplace with weather. Shepherds and smugglers and merchants crossed them constantly, and money crossed with them, so that a man like Bernat had felt the weight of currencies from both sides of the range and a few from further off. He knew what a real coin felt like in the hand. He knew the honest heft of silver and the softer give of a debased piece cut with lead. His fingers were a kind of instrument, calibrated by a lifetime of small, hard bargains, and when he closed his fist around the first of those 41 coins, every instrument he owned told him at once that this was money, and that it was money from nowhere he had ever been. The summer of 1904 had been violent. Storms came down off the peaks in walls of water, and one of them tore open a hillside that Bernat had crossed 1,000 times. When he came back through with his flock in early September, the land had changed its face. A slope he remembered as smooth grass had sheared away, and where the earth had peeled back an old wall stood exposed. Dry-laid stone, no mortar, fitted so tightly he could not have slid a knife blade between the blocks. Now, ruined walls are not rare in the Pyrenees. The mountains are full of them, old sheepfolds, hermit cells, border forts from wars nobody remembers. Bernat had seen 100. He would not have looked twice, except for one thing. This wall was curved. Not the rough curve of a collapsed pen, but a deliberate arc, part of something that had once been round and large and planned. And at the foot of it, washed loose by the storm, the coins were lying in the mud like fallen leaves. He counted them later. 41, all roughly the size of a large old franc, but heavier, dense in a way that money is not supposed to be. He rubbed one clean against his coat and held it up to the grey light, and this is where the ordinary story ends, and the strange one begins. The face on the coin was a man, not a saint, not a Roman emperor with a laurel crown, not a French king in profile. A man with a broad, flat face, high cheekbones, and a headdress that resembled nothing Bernat had ever seen in a church or a book or a fair. Around the edge, ran a band of writing. The letters were sharp and angular, a little like the runes carved into old grave markers up in the passes, and a little like nothing on earth. And on the reverse, where a coat of arms should have been, there was a single symbol above a single word. The symbol looked like a rayed sun sitting on top of a set of scales. A sun over a set of scales. Remember that too. Bernat did what any poor man would do. He put the coins in his satchel and he took them down the mountain, because coins are coins, and 41 heavy pieces of old metal might feed a family through a hard winter. He walked into the nearest town and set them on the counter of the man who bought silver and gold, and the man picked one up, weighed it in his palm, bit it, scratched it, and went very quiet. The metal was not silver, it was not gold, it was not any alloy the buyer recognized, and he had been buying metal for 30 years. It was pale, almost white, harder than it had any right to be, and it did not tarnish. He offered Bernat a fair price for the weight alone, and told him, quietly, that whatever these were, they were not from around here, and that he should be careful who he showed them to. That warning turned out to be the most useful thing anyone said to Bernat in the whole affair, and of course he ignored it. But the buyer's confusion is worth sitting with, because it was not the confusion of a fool. Metal buyers in mountain towns handled everything. Melted spoons, church silver, wedding rings, gold teeth, the scavenged fittings of 100 dead households. Their whole trade depended on knowing at a touch what a thing was worth, and being wrong meant losing money they did not have. This man staked his living on identifying metal, and the coin defeated him. It took a file mark, like something harder than silver. It rang, when he tapped it on the counter, with a high clean note that neither of them had heard from a coin before, and it would not tarnish. He set one on a damp window-sill for a week to see what the air would do to it, and at the end of the week it was exactly as pale and bright as the day the shepherd walked in. Silver blackens, copper greens. Even gold, soft and lazy, will pick up a film in the wrong company. This did nothing. It simply sat there, refusing to age, as if the ordinary chemistry of the world had agreed to leave it alone. A metal that is hard, pale, dense, rings like a bell, and does not corrode is not an exotic impossibility to a modern chemist. But it is a genuine problem for a supposed peasant hoax in a range with no such ore, no such foundries, and no reason on earth to counterfeit the currency of a country that, according to every authority Bernat could reach, had never existed. Word travels in mountain towns faster than any storm. Within a few weeks, a schoolteacher had heard about the shepherd with the impossible coins, and the schoolteacher wrote to a man he knew at the museum in Toulouse, and that letter is one of the few pieces of this story that historians agree actually existed, because a version of it was still in a provincial archive decades later. The letter described the coins in careful detail, the heavy pale metal, the broad-faced king, the angular script, the sun above the scales, and it asked a simple question. What kingdom is this? The museum's answer, when it came, was short and a little annoyed. There is no such kingdom. The coins were most likely a hoax, or gaming tokens, or foreign curiosities carried home by a soldier and lost. The script was dismissed as decorative nonsense. The metal was not tested, because testing cost money and nobody in Toulouse was going to spend it on a shepherd's fantasy. And here is where most stories would end. A poor man finds some odd coins, the experts wave them away, the coins vanish into a drawer, and history moves on. But Bernat did not move on, because Bernat had noticed something the museum had not, something you can only notice if you handle the coins yourself, instead of reading about them in a letter. The 41 coins were not all the same. They shared the same king, the same script, the same sun above the same scales. But the wear on them was different, and not randomly different. Some were crisp and sharp, freshly struck. Others were worn nearly smooth, the king's face rubbed down to a ghost. If these were fakes, someone had gone to the enormous trouble of faking decades of circulation, of making coins that looked like they had passed through thousands of hands over many years. Nobody fakes wear. There is no profit in it. Wear is what happens when money is used, over and over, in a real economy, by real people, for a long time. Which meant that somewhere, at some point, these coins had been spent, traded, saved, handed across counters, and dropped into purses. Somewhere there had been a market where a man could buy bread with the sun and the scales. And a market implies a town, and a town implies a road, and a road implies a country. You do not get a worn coin without a world to wear it down. So Bernat asked the only question that made sense to him. If this money was real, and it was used, then where did the people go? He began, in his own crude way, to investigate. He went back to the wall. Over the next 2 summers, working alone with a shovel between grazing seasons, he uncovered more of the curve. It was not a sheepfold. It was the base of a structure far too large and far too finely built for anything a mountain village would need, laid out in that same deliberate arc, oriented, as best he could tell, so that the rising sun on the longest day of the year would strike its centre. He found no more coins, but he found other things, pottery with the same angular marks pressed into the clay, a fragment of pale metal that might have been a hinge or a clasp, and, set into the foundation stones, worn almost flat by weather, the sun above the scales, carved again and again, as if whoever built the place wanted to be sure you knew whose ground you were standing on. Bernat, who could not read, decided the writing had to have a sound. He could not know what the word on the coins said. So he did what people have always done with mysteries too big for them. He named it himself. In the local telling, he took the symbol, the sun weighing the scales, and he called the country the balance of the Sunday, the empire that measured its worth against the light. And under that homemade name, he kept the story alive in the only archive available to a shepherd, which is the mouths of other people, told and retold in kitchens and at fairs until it hardened into a local legend that outlived the man himself. Now, if this were only a ghost story about a lonely shepherd, we could leave it on the mountain. But this is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about money itself, and about a set of questions that serious people, not cranks, have quietly wondered about for a very long time. Because the deepest problem with Bernat's coins was never the metal, or the script, or the face of the unknown king. The deepest problem was economic, and it is this: a single coin can be a fluke, a hoax, a token, a foreigner's souvenir, but a working currency cannot be a fluke. A currency, worn smooth by circulation, is the fossil of an entire system. To wear those coins down, you need mines to pull the metal, and smiths to strike it, and an authority trusted enough that people accept its stamp as worth something. You need debts settled and prices agreed and taxes collected. You need, in short, a state, a whole economic organism, breathing in raw metal and breathing out trust. And a state does not evaporate. States leave middens and taxes and letters and enemies. They leave neighbours who wrote them down, even if only to insult them. The Romans catalogued every tribe they ever fought. The Arab geographers mapped kingdoms most Europeans had never heard of. The medieval church counted every soul it could reach. So how do you hide an entire economy? How do you erase not just a country, but the ledger of a country, the debts and the coins and the memory of the coins, so completely that a shepherd in 1904 can hold its money in his hand and no expert alive can tell him whose face he is looking at? Think about what money actually is for a moment, because this is the heart of it. A coin is not wealth. A coin is a promise, compressed into metal. When you accept a strange disc of stamped metal in exchange for a real loaf of bread, you are not trading bread for metal, you are trading bread for trust. You are betting that the next person will accept the same disc from you, and the person after that, in an unbroken chain of belief that stretches out beyond anyone you will ever meet. That chain is the economy. The metal is just the token that keeps score, and a worn coin is proof that the chain held, that thousands of strangers, over many years, kept faith with the same promise, kept passing the same token, kept believing that somewhere behind it stood an authority that would make the promise good. So a circulating currency is not just evidence of a mint, it is evidence of a civilization's confidence in itself. To wear those 41 coins down to ghosts, the people of the balance of the sun had to trust their own state, generation after generation, more than they trusted their neighbours, more than they trusted gold, enough to build their entire daily life on its word. That is not something you fake. That is something you inherit, and lose, and cannot get back. The wear on Bernat's coins is the fingerprint of a vanished faith. Whatever those people believed in, They believed in it hard enough to leave the belief pressed into metal. And then, at some point, the believing stopped. The promise came due, and there was no one left to honor it. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. And the coins that had been trussed became, overnight, only strange heavy metal in the mud. That is the part that should unsettle an economist more than a historian, because it means the disappearance was not just the death of a people. It was the default of a currency so total that even the memory of the debt was wiped clean. No creditors came looking. No treaty absorbed it into a stronger neighbour's system. It did not inflate away or get pegged to some larger coin. It simply stopped, all at once or slowly, and everyone who had ever trusted it took that trust into the ground with them. This is the question that pulls the story out of the Pyrenees and into something much larger, because there is a whole current of thought, dismissed by mainstream historians and beloved by everyone who has ever felt that the official story has holes in it, which says that this kind of erasure is not only possible but has happened, more than once, on a scale we have been taught not to see. The idea goes by different names in different corners of the internet, but the shape of it is always the same. It says that the map of the past we were handed is too clean, that there are gaps in the record, sudden resets, cities that appear fully formed with no clear builders, architectural styles that repeat across continents that supposedly never spoke to each other. It says that somewhere in the last few centuries, a great deal of history was lost, or buried, or deliberately rewritten, and that a civilization, or several, was quietly filed under other names or simply left off the page. In this telling, the official record is not a photograph of the past. It is a painting, and someone chose what to leave out. And the people drawn to this current of thought will point you to a scattered collection of things that do not sit easily in the official account. Coins in museum drawers labelled unknown mint, filed and forgotten because no catalogue had a slot for them. Scripts that were never deciphered because no one could find a second sample to compare them against. Whole languages known only from a single stone. Trade goods that turn up hundreds of miles from anywhere they should have been, in graves that raise more questions than they answer. None of these things, on its own, proves a hidden empire. But taken together, the argument goes, they suggest a past that is lumpier and stranger and more full of holes than the smooth timeline we were handed in school. And into one of those holes, they say, a mountain people who weighed their worth against the sun could have quietly fallen. The most seductive version of the idea is not the loud one about grand conspiracies and deliberate cover-ups. It is the quiet one. It says that history is written by the literate and the victorious, and that everyone else, every people who kept their records in memory instead of ink, every economy too small or too remote or too brief to draw the attention of a chronicler, was simply never written down at all, not erased, just never recorded in the first place. And a thing that was never written down does not need a conspiracy to vanish. It only needs the last person who remembered it to die. You do not have to accept all of that, or any of it. Most historians will tell you, with good reason, that these ideas mistake the ordinary messiness of the record for a conspiracy, and that absence of evidence is not evidence of a cover-up. The gaps are usually just gaps. Records burn. Languages die. People forget. That is not a plot. That is time. And an unidentified coin in a drawer is almost always just a coin someone has not gotten around to identifying, not the last breath of a lost world. But Burnet's coins sit in the crack between those two views, and they refuse to be comfortable in either one. Because the mainstream answer, that they are a hoax, has to explain away the where, the metal that nobody could identify, the matching pottery, the great curved foundation with the same symbol carved into its stones, and the fringe answer, that they are the last money of an erased empire, has to explain why not one contemporary neighbour, not one tax record, not one insult from a rival king, mentions a people who paid for their bread with the sun and the scales. Neither answer closes the loop. And an open loop, if you have been paying attention to how these stories work, is exactly the kind of thing that keeps people awake. So let us take the economic thread as far as it will go, seriously, and see where it snaps. Suppose, just for the length of this sentence, that the balance of the sun was real. What would it have been? The clues, thin as they are, point somewhere specific. A high mountain people, wealthy enough to mint a hard, durable coinage in a metal that resisted corrosion, which is not a trivial achievement. A culture put a set of scales at the center of its money, which tells you what it valued. Not conquest, not a god of war. Balance, measurement, fair weight. This was, if it existed at all, a civilization that thought of itself as an economy first, a people who wrote their philosophy into their currency, who looked at a coin and saw not the face of a king but the promise of a fair exchange. And that, strangely, is the most convincing detail in the whole affair. Because a forger fakes what is impressive. A forger stamps gold with a warrior and a crown, because that is what sells. Nobody forges the money of a modest, obsessive, honest little mountain state, and then goes to the trouble of wearing it out. The very ordinariness of the idea, a hill people who cared about fair weight, is the thing that is hard to invent. If such a place existed, its disappearance would not need a grand conspiracy. It would need only what mountains have always delivered in abundance: a shift in the passes that carried trade, a plague, a hard century of storms like the one that opened the wall in 1904, a slow bleeding away of people down into the valleys, marrying into other villages, forgetting the old script within 3 generations because the young ones had no use for it. A currency stops circulating not with a decree but with a shrug, as the last people who trust it die, and their grandchildren melt the strange heavy coins for the metal, or bury them under a wall and move on. That is not erasure by an empire. That is erasure by ordinary human forgetting, which is far more ruthless and far more common than any secret order ever was. Which is the quiet, unsettling possibility underneath the whole story. Not that someone hid a civilization from us, but that no one had to. That the machinery of forgetting is so efficient, so relentless, that a working economy, a real people with real money and real ideas about fairness, can simply fall off the edge of memory, leaving behind 41 coins in the mud and a shepherd stubborn enough to insist they meant something. And what happened to that shepherd is its own small tragedy. The accounts thin out here, the way they always do when the interesting part is over and the sad part begins. Bernat kept telling his story, and the more he told it, the less anyone listened. To the museum, he was a nuisance. To his neighbours he became, in time, the old man with the coins, harmless and a little touched, the way we describe anyone who will not let go of a question the rest of us have agreed to stop asking. He is said to have written letters, though he could not write, which means he paid others to write them, spending money he did not have to send descriptions of the sun and the scales to institutions that filed them, if they filed them at all, under curiosities. He wanted, at the end, only one thing. He wanted someone with authority to test the metal, to hold the coin to whatever instruments the modern world had, and tell him, one way or the other, what it was and where it came from. He never got it. The men who could have answered him did not think the question was worth the cost, and by the time anyone might have, the coins were already scattering. Because that is the last and most frustrating turn in the whole affair. The coins did not survive together. Bernat sold some in that first hard winter, to the metal buyer who told him to be careful. Others he gave away, or traded, or lost. A handful, the story says, went to a collector who passed through the region and paid well and was never heard from again. By the time anyone came looking with real interest, decades later, the 41 had become a rumour of 41, and the trail split into a dozen dead ends, each ending in a drawer that turned out to be empty, or a family that remembered a heavy pale coin their grandfather used to have, but could not say where it had gone. A few objects that might be the coins have surfaced over the years, in the way these things always do. A pale disc in a private collection with no clear provenance. A photograph, badly lit, of something with a broad-faced king and an angular script, passed around and argued over, and never confirmed. A dealer's note, decades old, describing a heavy white coin from the southern mountains that would not tarnish, sold to a buyer whose name was never recorded. Each time, the same broken loop reopens. Each time, the metal is never quite tested, the script is never quite read, and the story slides back into the fog it came from. And there is something almost deliberate in how the trail keeps dissolving, though the honest explanation is probably the dull one. Anything valuable and unexplained tends to move quietly out of the light into hands that do not advertise what they hold. A coin that no expert can place is worth more as a private mystery than as a public one, so the 41 did what unclaimed treasure always does. It went underground a second time, this time not into a hillside but into the closed drawers of people who preferred not to be asked how they came by it. The mountain buried the coins once. Human beings, out of greed or caution or simple indifference, buried them again, and the second burial has proven far harder to dig through than the first, because you cannot open a private collection with a storm and a shovel. The result is that the single test that could settle the whole question, one clean assay of the metal, one patient reading of the script against any related sample, has still, after more than 100 years, never been done. Not because it is impossible, because the coins keep slipping out of reach of anyone who would bother to do it, exactly as they slipped out of reach of the shepherd who found them. So we are left, more than a century later, exactly where Bernat was left, holding a question we cannot close, and maybe that is the real point of standing on that mountain at all. Because whether the balance of the sun was a real empire or a shepherd's beautiful mistake, the story does something useful to the way we think about the past. It reminds us that the history we are handed is not the whole of what happened. It is only the part that got written down by the people who could write about the things they thought were worth remembering. Everything else, all the small honest economies, all the mountain peoples who cared about fair weight, all the currencies that stopped circulating with a shrug, sank without a splash, not hidden, just unrecorded. And the difference between hidden and unrecorded is the difference between a conspiracy and a heartbreak. Bernat could not read. He had no library to fool him and no theory to defend. He simply held something in his hand that the world could not explain, and he refused to pretend it was nothing. In an age of experts who knew better, a man who could not spell the name of the empire he had found turned out to be the only one taking the evidence seriously. He was probably wrong about almost everything, but he was right about the one thing that mattered. The coins were real. He had held them, and something, somewhere, had once used them to buy bread. We like to imagine that the past is finished, sealed, fully mapped, that everything worth finding has been found, and everything worth naming has been named. The truth is that the ground is still full of unopened drawers. Storms are still tearing hillsides open. Walls we have walked past 1,000 times are still curved in ways we have not thought to notice. And somewhere out there, in a private collection or a forgotten box or the mud below a broken slope, 41 heavy pale coins may still carry the face of a king no one can name, and the sun above the scales, waiting for someone patient enough, or stubborn enough, to finally ask them where they came from. There is a version of this story where Bernat is simply a lonely man who found some odd tokens and talked himself into a kingdom. That version is probably the true one, and it is not a small or foolish thing. Grief and wonder do strange work on a mind left alone on a mountain for months at a time, and a man can build an empire out of 41 coins and a curved wall if he needs the world to be larger than the one that has failed him. But even that gentler version leaves the coins exactly where they were, real, heavy, stamped by someone, spent by someone, still wholly unexplained. The mountain has not answered yet. But then again, no one has really been up there listening. The story of the balance of the sun is not over. It is only, like the shepherd who told it, still waiting for the one question that never came.